Oh, hi there. My name's Chandra Easton, and this talk is I've entitled it Steps on the Path. And the path that I'm speaking about is the spiritual path, and the steps that I'm speaking about are some of the steps that I've taken through my life, attempting to find and stay on the spiritual path. And I'm hoping that as a result of this talk, that you'll be able to reflect upon your life, your journey, the tools that you've used, the steps on your path. Okay, it's in two parts, and this is part one where I'll be covering my search for meaning, and this was from my sort of late teens and into my 20s, and then the path of the heart that took me up into my early 30s. When I get to part two, I'll be talking about how I found myself at the feet of the holy ones, the fiery path of service, and the trail of breadcrumbs. Okay, so I'm just starting with part one here, my search for meaning. I was probably, excuse me, in my late teens, 17, 18, when I started trying to figure out what am I here for, what makes me tick, who can help me, where will this journey commence? And I was living in Brisbane at the time, and I found myself at the relaxation centre. I'm enrolled in a course that was in covering matters to do with spiritual healing and auras and angels and extrasensory perception. And I found all of this extremely interesting, and got deeply involved in it for a couple of months, I suppose. Now I understand that this particular aspect of the path is referred to as the path of mysticism. I didn't know that at the time, but what I did know was that this ability to read another person's aura or communicate with beings who weren't there in the physical was extremely easy to me. And yet, for some reason, it wasn't quite the peace I was looking for. So I never forgot it, but I didn't pursue it any further, and I continued to look. The next part of my life's journey that was relevant was when I was introduced to the occult path, what I now know as the occult path. And this was primarily through my mother, who was deeply involved in Eastern mysticism. And she was also an artist. And I found that I was very attracted to symbolism. And for a while, I studied palmistry, and I used to thumb through my mother's books on Eastern mysticism and symbolism. And then I found the tarot cards, what we refer to as the unbound book of Thoth from the ancient Egyptian traditions. And I found the tarot cards very, very useful for I was interested in uncovering more of myself, and I found them useful for self-reflection. And I also found them useful as a conversational tool to be able to work with other people. And I sort of realised that I had a career. I wouldn't have known about the word vocation, that I was looking for a career or a life direction where I could work closely with people and help them. And the tarot cards seemed to be a tool for this. Another one of the things that I discovered and touched upon at this point in my life, around about age 20, I think, was theosophy. And I encountered the theosophists in Brisbane at the time. And I was attracted because they had these really interesting books. And I was a lover of books, and I found the books, these old arcane books, very interesting. But something about the group of people, well, they were a different generation to me, and they didn't call me. And so I kind of moved on from the theosophy. And again, it was my mother who suggested, why don't you have a look at astrology? And so I had my natal chart done with an astrologer in Brisbane, well-known astrologer at the time in the late 1970s. And it intrigued me. How did this man who was a stranger seem to know things about me based on my date, place, and time of birth? And being an extremely curious person, I just felt that I had to find out. I had to understand where this knowledge and this wisdom came from. And so I began my study. It took me over about the next 9 years or so. And as a result of this, I I bought books, I attended lectures, I went to courses. This was local astrologers, national astrologers, international astrologers, seminars, and I developed quite a strong astrological network and began to work professionally as an astrologer in my 20s. Of course, now I know that this is the occult path, and there are two paths, the mystical and the occult. And the occult engages one actively with the mind, whereas the mystical is the non-verbal, the intuitive, the music, the art. So I'd started on the mystical, and then I'd put it aside and thrown myself, dive deeply into the occult path of a traditional astrology. And of course, astrology, which is based on astronomy, is simply a mirror to help people, for seekers, to find and understand and know themselves. And I learned that the astronomy translates to psychology, and that the natal chart is a map, or well, it's a map of potential, and that it could be used to help one understand oneself, one's interpersonal dynamics, relationships. But of course, there's free will involved in the map, and the free will means that even though the map unfolds a bit like a tree unfolds through its cycle of growth, we have our choice, our free will. How do we use the transits or the progressions? There are many facets of astrology, and I was studying a little bit of political and mundane astrology. And mundane's, you know, how do you predict things from the weather, and the politics is useful for world events. But what most interested me was medical astrology and karmic astrology and spiritual astrology. And so I explored all three of these, and the medical I found called me strongly, and yet I didn't have a medical background, and so I could only go so far with that. The karmic astrology intrigued me. You know, what is the karma that we've brought with us into this lifetime? The positive and the not so positive. What's the dharma? What's the life purpose? How do we access the past lives and the spiritual? And I found this deeply interesting, but none of the books that I could read seemed to give me the answers that I was seeking. And I felt towards the end of my 20s, I was in my late 20s, that I'd hit a bit of a wall, that the astrology, it was like I'd hit a brick wall, and there were limitations to it. And I was looking for something more to help me understand. I could see the doorway to the past lives and the karmic matters in the charts, but I couldn't get enough information. And the clients didn't seem to know, and nothing in the books resonated. And so I was effectively looking for another tool. I'd come to a crossroads in my life, and I was living in the Northern Rivers at the time. And so I started looking around to see what else was on offer. And I settled upon past life therapy. And I enrolled in a group, and then this continued on into a 12-month training where I learned how to work as a spiritual healer with the modality of past life therapy. And foundational to this was meditation and silence. And, and I worked very intensively with the past life therapy, literally once a week for about 11 months, which I wouldn't recommend that anyone do, because it's extremely intense process of uncovering aspects of oneself. And as I went deeply in through this portal to the inner self, I found that it was a bit like the healing that I'd encountered in my teens, that it was easy for me to access my past lives. It was easy for me to dive deeply into this therapeutic work with light. And many lifetimes I uncovered. Some were easy, and some were more challenging. And I felt that old harm was being neutralized, and I was learning a skill that was extremely useful. But of course, other things were happening throughout this year. I was having all kinds of breakthrough sensations to do with light, and to do with sound, and to do with the realms beyond the physical into the inner dimensions. Were I was moving between the inner and the outer life, and it was extremely attractive, but also a little disorienting. And of course, now I understand that what was happening is that some of my inner senses were being awakened, some of my karma was being cleansed, some of the Kundalini energies there was movement around the chakras. And towards the end of that particular year, it was 1989. My teacher was leaving the district, and I decided to do a 7-day intensive. And there was a particular lifetime that I'd been grappling with, that had come where I'd been in ancient Egypt, and there was great harm connected to this lifetime. And as a result of having 7 days exclusively to focus upon this therapeutic work, I had an enormous breakthrough. And the breakthrough was to do with honesty and to do with the recognition of patterns that I'd been carrying with me all the way from ancient Egypt, all the way through to my current incarnation. It was to do with keeping harm and old hatred and blame. And as a result of the potency of the light from this group and the opportunity and the willingness to dive deeply into it, I had tremendous breakthrough. And as a result of that, what happened was that I entered more deeply into what I could only call a stream of love. And my life was transformed. My life's never been the same again. And of course, many people have experiences where they move beyond their outer personality and move through the physical, the emotional, the mental, into the deeper realms. And what I discovered was that there was a divine heart within me, and that I experienced relationships and love during that year, and especially in that week, as extremely expansive. And my life changed so fundamentally that I just became love. And the way I understand it is that it was just the tiniest taste of the divine heart within that whet my appetite to find more. And my life changed so fundamentally. I subsequently discovered that I was pregnant with my third child. But what happened was that I had light pouring out of the palms of my hands, and I could all kinds of inner senses had awakened, and my life had changed so fundamentally that I knew that the first chapter was over, it was finished, it was concluded. And so I'd found myself, even though I didn't know what I was looking for, somehow or other I'd found my way onto the path of the heart. And it was because I'd been able to remove some of the layers of history, some of the old personalities, and learn some of the lessons. And of course, I'd just begun this sort of inner revelatory journey because I'd deeply connected into a spiritual practice of meditation. And that year was a year of inner revelation. And out of it, I came this sort of burning sort of search for the divine love and a new Dharma, a new way of working in the world. And so I put aside for a few years my astrological work, and I tended to the next phase of my life, which was family and, of course, healing. Because, of course, all of us have many things happening at once. And while I was a seeker on the spiritual path and I'd had this spiritual breakthrough, I was also married. I had 2 children. I was pregnant with my third. I was up to my eyeballs in family life and what I now know to be the householder path. With all the Dharma and the karma, it was extremely purposeful. There were so many things that I could learn that way that I wouldn't have learned any other way, not the least of which were patience and love, which all of my children taught me just to help me be in the moment. Yes, but the personality doesn't give up easily, And even though I'd had this profound sense of deepening of love and entry into other realms, I had so many questions. What on earth had happened to me in that 12 months preceding this breakthrough? Why is it that I could see beings who weren't in the physical, talk to angels, communicate with those who'd passed over? Why was it that I could speak to other people's spiritual guides and see their past incarnations. So I was kind of consumed with a search to find answers to all these questions. And I tried speaking to people that I knew, and nobody seemed to really have the answers. And the other thing that had happened was that I'd encountered this profound beating heart, which I remember describing to people as being like a rose pink expanding beehive that was kind of humming. And I remember going around to a couple of spiritual teachers at the time and asking them, do you know what this is? Nobody seemed to be able to answer my questions. So I turned to books, as I often have, and specifically I found the Alice Bailey books. Now, the Alice Bailey books were written between the 1930s and the 1950s, and they were written by Alice Bailey, and they came from the Lord Dwell Kul, a Tibetan master, and they were transmitted telepathically to Alice. And there was something about these books, and I'd seen these books before because I was a lover of books. I'd taken them off the shelf and I'd looked at them, and in the past I'd never been able to make head nor tail of them. But somehow or other now, because of what had happened in the preceding year, which I primarily put down to the discipline of meditation, was that I was able to read these books, and they seemed extremely familiar to me. Very, very familiar, and I didn't quite know why. And of all these books, the ones that particularly called me were the Treatise on the Seven Rays. And there was a book on esoteric astrology, and of course I was a traditional astrologer. What was esoteric astrology? It was esoteric psychology. I didn't know what this was. Esoteric healing. Well, I'd been involved in healing, but I didn't know what esoteric healing was. And something called I've got the path there. It's actually the rays and the initiations. And so I deeply began to study and absorb these books. Now, not necessarily easy, particularly the esoteric astrology book, because it operates, humanity, we all are going through our own expansions of consciousness as we deepen our connection to the heart. And astrology has three different layers of interpretation according to the consciousness of the individuals. And so I realized a few years ago that I had outgrown traditional astrology. And all of a sudden I realized that esoteric astrology was what I'd been looking for. And so I began immersing myself in it. But I had to, there's something about esoteric astrology that requires the heart and the head. Not possible just to work with this astrology just through the mind. Anyway, I'm reading the book Esoteric Astrology, and I was about 30 pages into the book, and clear as a bell, I hear a voice that quite matter-of-factly begins to dictate to me my life purpose, connected to these books, the Treatise of the Seven Rays. And I realised that somehow or other, as a result of what's happened in the last couple of years, that I've been able to connect in to the stream of consciousness, which is the Lord Dwell Kul, the Lord DK, the author of these books. And he's describing to me my work with the books from the Treatise of the Seven Rays, my work with astrology, my work with psychology, my work with healing. And he's describing it in chapter and verse, a lot of detail, what to do and what to teach and what to write, and college. And this was, well, it felt very on point, but also quite overwhelming. On point because I recognised these teachings and these books. It's as if I knew it from another incarnation. And in fact, in truth, I did. And yet I felt all at sea. Well, it's like, are the books enough? Don't I need a teacher in the physical? Is the work with the Lord Dwell Kul? And for the next, I think it was about 3 years, I immersed myself in this inner connection through the Lord Dwell Kul, and began to study and understand something about the path of enlightenment. But of course, this brought up a whole other conundrum. I was living in the Northern Rivers at the time, And I'd been reading in these books about the path of enlightenment and the nature of light and the path of Buddhahood and the Lord Maitreya and this sort of energy of divine and cosmic love and how it was possible to embody this. And so I just thought, well, that's it. I have to find an enlightened teacher. And so I began looking all around the Northern Rivers, and I visited this group and that group and the other group. I was looking for a teacher who was evidence of these teachings that the Lord Waltul had been talking about, but I couldn't find such a teacher. So I stayed with the Lord Dwell Cool, and even though I had social and some connections with other spiritual groups and teachers, none of them really, I just knew they weren't the right people or the right groups. Yes. And so I continued my study, continued my reading. As you can imagine, these books take decades to integrate. Anyway, it's 1989, and I'm reading a book called The Externalization of the Hierarchy. And somewhere in this book, I come upon this sentence that stops me in my tracks. And the sentence goes something like this. It says, towards the end of this century, this is the 20th century, a hierarchical teacher will come to the Southern Hemisphere, Australia and New Zealand, and bring forth the next chapter, an update for humanity for the 21st century. Well, I found this sentence, well, that was it. You know, I closed the book and I knew without a shadow of a doubt that the next stage of my life was to find this hierarchical teacher, because the Lord Dwell Cool had told us it was in the Southern Hemisphere, he or she. And so I had this urgent inner prayer, one might say a demand, to find this hierarchical teacher, because I had so many questions and I needed a teacher in the physical. And up until that point in my life, I'd been quite resistant to spiritual teachers, and for a variety of reasons. But what happens, and I now know that when the pupil's ready, the teacher appears. And subsequently, and literally within a matter of days, it took 3 days, there was a miracle that came into my life as a result of this urgent prayer. And the miracle came in the form of an invitation from a friend to attend a ceremony, an earth healing service, as it was called, at the Buddhist Gompa in the nearby town Kyogle. And so I went along and experienced this circle of light and the downpouring of light. And you see, I'd been experiencing downpourings of light during my training as past life therapist and over the last couple of years, but experiencing it in a group format, well, this was something new and different. And I felt very strongly that there was something about this group and the beings of light, the invisible beings of light, that represented my spiritual home. Now, it took me, I'm not sure how long, maybe a few months before I finally joined the dots and realised that this was the answer to my prayer, and it had come 3 days later. And I was introduced to the Society of Maitreya Theosophy and the Lady Ananda Sham at that meeting. But in the months to come, I also made contact with the University of the Seven Rays and Michael Robbins, who was the founder of this university. And so for the next 2 years, I was connected into both groups, primarily into the Society of Maitreya Theosophy. Through their publications, I would go down to meetings, various events that occurred at the festivals, Christmas and Easter. And I also went down, less involved with Michael Robbins' group, but I do remember going down and contributing to the Sydney conference. Yes, and so this finding of the teacher on the physical indicated to me that the second chapter of my life was complete. I was 33 years old and I was ready for whatever the next stage was. I didn't quite know what it was, but I knew that I was ready for it. Okay, so this completes the part 1 of this talk, Steps on the Path, and there's a few links there. And